An interesting, but I think actually kind of underdeveloped idea, a side effect of the cash injection that's happened in North American CSGO with all these big organizations, particularly the League of Legends ones, coming into the sector, this area, investing a lot of money, a lot of them in North American lineups, actually. Beyond TSM and Envious, it's all going into NA players, NA lineups. Some teams that were placing last place at ESEA lands never have placed top X in majors. So a lot of money coming in, and relative to even some of the top European teams, sometimes more money. And we heard these stories of Skadoodle signing bonus. We heard about Hiko shopping around all these different orgs that were all offering him lots of money. And one of the aspects which actually very briefly was touched upon as a rumor was actually the King Win concept, where they took all these like star names that were left around in the scene and weren't in a top team. You know, they made this lineup in Europe. Well, one of the early rumors was that Hiko was going to be involved in a similar scenario. He would take in Makalele and these players and make his own transatlantic super team of big names left over, but one that potentially could also work out. Now, this in itself has some very interesting potential, outcomes that could happen if it was to take place. But first and foremost, I think that when you talk about the transatlantic connection, bringing players over from Europe, which is the way really it should go, I actually think this is a good idea that should be explored more. Yes, it's all well and good to build the NA scene and try and get certain players better and get the right mix of players. This is an approach to success. This is a long-term approach especially. But if right now you're an organization with the money, recruiting one or two of the EU players, especially if it's the right one or two, the right gamble or the right piece that'd fit in your team, will right now elevate your team immediately and potentially give you a chance to be very, very good in certain cases or better in others and competitive with Europeans. So first and foremost, I like that idea, which has almost not been done so far. Okay, yes, Pyth went over to Luminosity, but before Luminosity made these other roster moves, Luminosity didn't particularly look like that, like a very impressive team, and they didn't look like a team that would even be capable of challenging for NA. So, and as a move, he wasn't some superstar name where it's like, oh, he'll definitely make them the best NA team. No, not at all. So that's like the most low-level example of that happening. What I want to see is real potential star quality names in Europe get added to a good NA team and see what can happen then. Now that's the base level. Like if it was up to me, I could make a whole video just about that. But I want to talk about the concept of, will we ever have a transatlantic super team? Like multiple good players from NA, multiple good players from EU, mix them in a team. And again, they don't have to live together. They can just practice before the big LAN. And how could they do? What is the potential for this? Unfortunately, it seems quite unlikely because even though the money is now there, and even though the opportunity is now there, where there's certain opportunities that aren't in Europe, but could exist within the money and the space of NA because there's space for star players, I feel like teams are locked in the old mentality, both European teams and some of the North Americans who wouldn't want to even try that, or wouldn't think it's possible, where they probably won't attempt this. But if they were, it would be interesting because the right mix could be very, very explosive and very exciting. So first and foremost, I have to talk a little bit about the context of when this happened in 1.6, the most famous example and the best example. Now, the example of just one player coming over, that happened a few times with success. Like Zet went over in CS Source to the complexity lineup there, and in the first season, they were the best CS Source team. Lopez came over as an in-game leader and transformed Evil Geniuses from like the fourth or third or fourth best NA team to at one point in time the fifth or sixth best team in the whole world, and even beat Fnatic in a best of three and won a medium-sized to small LAN. MSI beat it and had numerous top four placings at big international tournaments. So in terms of what I referred to before, just bringing one player over, that's the approach I'd rather take. Either take one star and add him to an existing team, or more importantly, take an in-game leader who has a lot of sense, especially experience in the European scene and how to practice and how to execute strats. Bring him over and put him with a bunch of NA skilled players and see what you can do there. They're the two most obvious ones. But in terms of an actual proper super team, like half and half, the example in history is a team called NoA. Now, what's really important to understand about NoA, and this is something I'll write an article about probably at some point in time so I can go more in depth, but the basis of what you have to understand first and foremost is that initially, the reason why this is very possible is because NoA wasn't a super team at day one. The concept behind NoA was they had these three Norwegian players. There was BSL, famous in-game leader, but not particularly skilled player, but a guy with a good sense for how the game should be played as an in-game leader, and an okay level of skills for a pro. There was Nikon, who was quite a skilled defensive player, had a very good niche quality in that sense, but wasn't a very outgoing person. He's Norwegian as well, so that means it's very you don't really get chances in the Swedish scene. It was all Swedes stayed with themselves there, and the Norwegian scene didn't have much sponsorship at the time. So even though he's a good player, first of all, he's not a superstar player. He's just a very, very reliable, solid player, sort of like a mini Crims, not quite on the level of Crims at the moment, but a mini version where he's like not a star, but but very, very solid and very fundamentally solid. You can put him in a spot and know he'll get the 1 or 2 kills on that map, particularly famously the upper floor on Nuke. Knoxville is a guy who's played with BSL, played with Nikon all this period. At times has been an in-game leader in Neolithic early on, and he's more of a support player. Not a particularly skilled player, just a support player. So we've got what we've kind of got in those 3 players there. Here's the key thing: is like reliable, supportive players who have experience, who've played at the top, who've played with other good players, and they've played with stars in Europe. And now what we do is we get those 3 players, because this is what's interesting. It's actually the opposite to what you do in NA now. That's why I'm saying with the context. Then the star quality actually came from NA, believe it or not. They had Method, who was a very, very skilled aimer, but the problem was he was very erratic. Like, he wasn't an intelligent player. He's a guy you really had to control. Like, you had to tell him, go here, don't do this, like, follow me now. His communication wasn't very good, but his raw skills were very, very, very high level. But he wasn't a world-class player in the same sense as some of the other players, because a lot of the world-class players, the Potties, like, whoever you're thinking of at the time, Element, they all had a polished quality to their game, whereas that's what he lacked. He was just raw skill. And then you had Shagwa, and Shagwa, again, could be a very explosive AWPer, but at the time he was still charging up. He was still a top NA player, but he hadn't quite taken the leap to becoming a world-class player. He was a very good NA player, and he could have games against the top teams, like he could upset people, but he wasn't quite established as like a world-class AWPer in the same sense. So these were the 2 explosive qualities, and what you did is pair them with this team play framework that's played before and is going to tell them how to play and where to put them. And in their first tournament, they shockingly came from like the 32nd seed at a CPL to finish 2nd place behind the legendary SK Sweden, which at the time was beating everyone and dominating, just not even losing maps to anyone. So that in itself was amazing. But the best NoA lineup actually came later on, where what they did is, through a bunch of roster moves, they eventually managed to get BSL out, and they replaced him with Element, who at the time was considered the best player in the world. Not the most skilled at all, but he was a player where he had an incredible sense for the game. He could just always be in the perfect position for each situation. He could always rotate around the map, seemingly as if he had a wall hack, knowing where the enemy will be, where they are right now, what they're going to do next. And so he could always, with his decent but not godlike skill set, always get the most out of it and could have an incredible game impact. Absolutely phenomenal player, and could be an in-game leader. So they got Element as a key piece, but actually initially they did badly. They got upset at a couple of events. Then, here's the key move. Then they managed to get in Executor. And now when they got an Executor, he was the best in-game leader at the pure Execute style. Like, he'd taken over from Vessel and learned from him, and he had really good set Execute style. So what they did is they paired Executor and Element. In terms of Element would read the game, Execute would call the strats. And then within the lineup, okay, they still have Method, who's still just the same player, but the key thing that had happened was Shagwa's AWPing had developed a lot, like playing so many international competitions and with international players. He managed to develop his game. So this year, 2004, was his best year in terms of individual play. His level got really, really good. And at this point in time, he legitimately was a top 10 player in the world. So now this was the lineup that was able to win a CPL event and was able to do very well and beat the Eyeballers lineup, a legendary lineup. Now, the key thing there, if you notice, is there's different eras. Like the first era, they take in the team play aspect from Europe and they have the stars from NA. In the second era, they bring in the best in-game leader and one of the superstars of Europe, Element, into the lineup and actually Execute is who I meant by the best in-game leader, but you see what I mean there? So it's actually a mix of half and half. Now, if you're going to do this sort of a lineup now... Oh, but one other thing to add. Part of the reason why their results were erratic in NoA is because back then, you used to only have a big tournament every sort of 2 to 3 months at most, if not like 4 to 5. And so what they used to do was live in separate continents and just have time off. And then 2 to 3 weeks or a month before the big tournament, they'd get together, start boot camping, build things up. Now, that's the most extreme way to do it. I wouldn't recommend anyone do it now. With how much money there is and how many tournaments, you wouldn't need to now. You could spend time living apart, but then the idea is you'd come together for 3 to 4 months and you'd play 2 to 3 tournaments at least, and you'd get a rhythm going. Then you could maybe have a month off in the off season where you go apart. So I think that aspect you could overcome some of the problems in NoA had. But if you're trying to do it in terms of CSGO, the problem is what's going to be different from an NoA is that it's very unlikely you're going to make it in the same fashion that you made those NoA lineups. So think of the first one where it was the team play aspect came from Europe. That's almost definitely not going to happen. Like, you could do that to a very small degree in what I referred to initially, where you just bring in one player. Like when you brought in Lurpus to Evil Geniuses and he brought in an in-game leadership structure and taught them how to play the game in the modern meta. Okay, you could do that if you got someone like a Threat. That might work. But odds are that's not the sort of big profile move someone would make if they were going to make this importing of a European player. Instead, they're going to go the skill route. And if we're going to make an NoA team, we're going to take the skill from Europe, we're going to add it with the pieces from NA. So if we're going to get the pieces from NA, okay, yes, Hiko's a star player in NA, but also what he brings is like he's very stable. He's like kind of a Nikon type player. We'd get a Hiko type player, and then we'd get another player. The idea is now They can even be a support player. We could have like a Cutler or someone like that. And then what we'd want to do is we'd want to put them with legit star talent from Europe. So who's the legit star talent? Now, first and foremost, you're almost never going to get players of the star level of the stars of this NoA team, because they were some world-class players. But okay, there's one immediately. In fact, there's one or two that would be viable for that if you could pay the money and get them over there. So the obvious one's Scream. His skill level is, he's like a method, actually. That's what's funny. He's a very good analogy for method. Incredible aim, incredible explosive ability, but you have to really give him a lot of freedom. And yet at the same time, you have to give him freedom to do what he wants to do, but then also help him and facilitate him playing to his level. Because if you just leave him and you don't tell him certain things or back him up in certain ways, he's also not going to be very effective in the team concept. So Scream's an obvious one. And at the moment, he's kind of stuck. I mean, he's in Kingwin at the moment, so he's not going to do it, but he's kind of stuck in hell in that he's not in a top 5 team or top 6 team, which would warrant his skills. Now, the other player, a really obvious one to me, admittedly, he's only in this situation because of his ban, is Simple. Those are the two players where if you could get those two players right now, they legit are world-class players, some of the best players in the world. And if you added them to the right NA mix, would immediately make an NA team that should be able to compete for like a top 6 spot in the world with the right mix of players. So Simple is an absolutely phenomenal player. And right now, his peak is absolutely incredible. He has a total all-round game. He is naturally, personality-wise, seemingly quite arrogant and self-confident, but in a way that I kind of like, because even though it might degrade teammate aspects, he could work on that definitely. You can also see from the way he plays, he's incredibly bold. He doesn't actually believe when he takes these 1v1s that this guy can beat him or will beat him. And there's so few players, no matter what they tell you, actually have that like core belief, because it's based on his skill and he knows what he's capable of. So Scream and Simple are the obvious ones. But okay, there's other skilled players that have a bit more wiggle room to them. So Schneider would be one that I would consider in a mix like this if I'm going to bring European players over. Very experienced, has played with some of the best players in the world, has repeatedly had good performances. In the latter days of his time in Fnatic, actually, him and Flusher were the best players. JW struggled very much so. Devil Walker's just a pure support player. Pronox was just the in-game leader. It really was Schneider and Flusher who used to carry that Fnatic team. At times he has been very good. Now apparently the reason he was removed from Fnatic, supposedly he wasn't as motivated, and maybe there's some tension between certain players, and you see he hasn't been picked up to a NA, but he hasn't, and even if he's had the offers, he hasn't accepted them. So whether you could get him there is another thing, but I think he would definitely be a very viable name to put in this mix. Now, the other name of the true star quality players I have is one that actually I'll admit right now he's not a star, and I don't know if he ever could be a star again. But when he was, and if he could ever go full-time and get back to that level, Dennis, the former LGB in-game leader. He can be an in-game leader, admittedly not a true in-game leader. Like, he's not like going to execute strats and read the opponent. It's more of a run-and-gun loose style of in-game leader. But he carries with that, he was a star player. Him and Olafem were the two best players in that LGB team. He can AWP, he can rifle, he's aggressive, likes to run and gun style, very high octane approach to the game. I think this would work great for NA, where you've got all these talented Mad Fragger style, well, wannabe Mad Fraggers. They're not at the level of the Europeans like the Screams, etc., but the players who want to be like the Roker, Desi, who else have we got? I mean, in theory, I guess you'd count some of the others in that kind of category. They all tend to want to be aggressive, Tarek to a degree, but you could put these players in there with someone like this, and that would actually be the ideal style of play, I think. Now, going beyond them, there are other names we can consider, but they all have even more caveats to them. So, okay, Twist. Yes, there are times in 2013, early 2014, where he looked phenomenal. He looked like really skilled. But first of all, he was playing with Olaf M, with Dennis, etc. He's never truly shown that ultimate top level with any consistency. Now, is that because he doesn't go all in on the game? Is he just a very up and down player, in which case maybe there is no massive upside and we're just imagining it all? That's a harder one. He's kind of more in the Pyth category, where you're going to be taking a gamble if you bring him. It's not for certain immediately that you'll be that good. Makalele, likewise, because the problem with Makalele is, in an ideal world for me, Makalele should be the 3rd or 4th best player in a team. Because then his explosive, volatile nature means he's going to win games for you by being the X factor, not by being the best player, but by being the X factor that tips you over the edge, where the rest of your team performance is very solid. Then he's just adds in the extra amount that's going to win you a couple of rounds, win you a half, and get you through a certain map. If he has to be your best player that you're going to rely on and start, that's why Kingwin's going to have issues. And especially in an NA team, if he was your best or second best player, I don't think you're ever going to be a top 6 team in the world if you've got this NA lineup, because the others in the player lineup won't match up against the rest of the EU teams, and then Makalele won't match up against the world-class stars of like the Alu, the Olafem, Kenny S sort of players. Now, Rain, another player from Kingwin. Rain would be good in terms of a solid middle player. Again, if you could have him as your 3rd best player in some NA team that had like a Skadoodle and now you're cooking with gas. He's very reliable, very solid, has some experience. I think that would be a great pickup if you wanted to make like that sort of a Hiko Skadoodle super team. And then the last name I already mentioned, Threat, as an in-game leader, just a pure in-game leader this time. Not going to do any of the genius stuff and not going to do any great plays. But if we brought in, say, Threat, Rain, and Scream, now throw in a couple of other players, and now we're cooking the gas. Now we've got a real lineup on our hands where this could do something. Yes, they'd have to acclimatize and figure out the style of play and all of that good stuff, but hypothetically, this is an approach that could work. So I do think the seeds are there and the circumstances are there in the way that they actually weren't even in their NoA days, where you could make one of these lineups. Now, I don't think it'll happen, unfortunately, because European players in general want to just stay in Europe. They'd rather try and make the best of a situation they have there and just hope their team can improve. There's also lots of lands in Europe, so they feel like they've got chances there. Yes, the NA teams have money, but can they persuade this guy that it's going to work? And can they persuade him that the team he's going to isn't just going to be money, but death for him, like a poison chalice, that we're actually going to be good, and this is an opportunity that we can go somewhere from here. That's where maybe we have to wait 6 months to see where the scene is in 6 months. Is there more money? Is there the same money? Are there more lands in NA? Has NA developed a bit more? Maybe then, and also some contracts end, where this will be more of a viable move. But I'd love to see either that, do a one-off super team, but the right style, or let's just bring in the right talents that for now will like kind of be catalysts to make certain NA teams better, like one in-game leader, or better, bring in a coach, or bring in, like, I would have, if I were them, I would have paid for certain players like someone like Threat, even maybe just be a coach, Flaren if you could have, obviously you can't, but Devil Walk, these people can give you some knowledge and give you some framework of how to play and how to practice, or just bring in individual players and add them in. But I think it's, as a concept, it's a very tempting one. It's one that fans love to speculate at an NoA style team. But as I mentioned, even NoA had its issues and really had to go to the max of its abilities to get those great results. So it's an interesting idea, I think.